All right. Thank you very much, Lars. So, my name is Remco, as Lars mentioned, and in this presentation I will share the preliminary results from my thesis work about the effect of anthropogenic noise pollution on the behavior of Atlantic cod. And the study was performed in Tvedestrand in Norway. So, as I said, it's preliminary results. I'm still working mostly on the interpretation of the results, but I will share with you what I have concluded so far. So, first of all, why did I choose cod? Well, in Norway, cod is a very important marine resource. The export value in 2020 was around 1 billion euros. And besides this, because of the long fishing tradition in Norway, it has a lot of cultural value as well. As for marine noise pollution, there are very little regulations. They're almost non-existent because little is known about the effects that it has on the marine environment. A lot of studies come to the same conclusion that there is a lack of information on the effect of noise, and this goes especially for small motorboats. Part of this reason is because many bigger ships are tracked using AIS transmitters, which is automatic identification systems, which is basically a sort of GPS to track the movement of ships. However, recreational vessels are not obligated to have them, but these are the most frequent vessels and dominant contributors of underwater noise in shallow coastal areas. So, and these coastal areas are where cod spawn, so it is a very vital ecosystem. So with my thesis, I wanted to address this lack of information through an observational study with the following question: how is Atlantic cod affected by noise pollution from small boats? So let's break down this question a little bit. First, how is Atlantic cod affected? What do I mean by that? I wanted to look mostly into how cod are affected in the short term, and based on literature, there are two likely short-term effects. First of all, they can be affected in their movement, and the two most straightforward ways are home range and depth, as Marie also said in the previous presentation. Second of all, cod are a vocal species, and their vocalizations might be masked, which means that they basically have to compete with the increase in background noise to be heard. And this could lead to the Lombard effect, which is an involuntary adaptation of vocal effort when there is loud noise around them. And that might lead to vocal strain. So to summarize this point, I'm looking at how noise affects the home range, the depth, and cod vocalizations. This is what we can expect. This is a typical cod grunt. And from the waveform, we can infer several things, and these things I will refer to as vocalization characteristics. First of all is the length of the duration, which is simply the amount of seconds that the duration or the entire call took. We have a number of pulses, which we can see numbered here in the bottom. We have a pulse period, which is the length of a single pulse. And fundamental frequency. That's not showed here because it's calculated in a different way, but it's the basis frequency of the call. Furthermore, I included fatigue. I mentioned vocal strain earlier, and fatigue is one measure of that. And this was used by another team of researchers when they looked at gobies, and they found that fatigue can be measured by looking at the difference between earlier pulse periods and later pulse periods. So to give this more of a clear definition for my study, I looked at the mean of the first 3 pulse periods, which is this first term, and the mean of the last 3 pulse periods, which is the second term. So the fatigue is a ratio. So now to define noise pollution from small boats. Kaplan and Mooney found that small boats particularly impact frequencies below 1000 Hertz. This is some of their results, where we can see 4 different recordings, and in each of the recordings we can see after 0 kilohertz there's a steep increase, and most of the effect is stopped before the 1 kilohertz. This is further supported by Holmes et al., who found that while the motorboat was active, power spectral levels were particularly raised from 100 to 1000 Hertz. So to get the definition straight, when I speak about noise, I speak about small vessel anthropogenic noise, particularly 100 to 1000 Hertz. Home ranges, I'm talking about the size of the area where there's a 95% chance to find a cod in a 3-hour window. Marie explained this before as well with the kernel utilization distribution. And with the vocal characteristics, I will talk about the characteristics of the grunt, as I showed you before. So the hypotheses were that noise will have a significant effect on vocal statistics, on home range, and on depth. And the data we needed for this was for the vocalization statistics, recordings of the noise to quantify this, and of course recordings of Gadus vocalizations. For the second one, we also need records of XY movement, the horizontal movements. And for depth, we also need, well, records of the vertical movement. To get these, all of the recordings were obtained using a hydrophone, and records of XY movement and depth were obtained by telemetry, which Marie already explained. Basically, an acoustic tag is implanted, sends a signal to nearby receivers, and then these receivers obtain the location of the god at a moment in time. Data was collected in Tvedestrand, as I mentioned. This is Norway, and this is the Skagerrak water, and Tvedestrand lies here in between Oslo and Kristiansand. So this was these were the boundaries of the study area, and as we can see, there are around 20 telemetry stations in this study area. I only had one hydrophone at my disposal, so I had to use the same hydrophone to both record noise and record the Gadus vocalizations, and that is why the hydrophone is placed pretty central in the study area. The hydrophone was kept in place with a concrete mooring at the bottom and a subfloat which pulled the hydrophone up, keeping the head stable at around 5 meters from the bottom of the fjord. The hydrophone was set to record the first 10 minutes of every hour, and it was put in place September 1st and recorded until mid-November, because that's when the battery ran out. So it collected 77 days of data. To analyze the telemetry data, I also applied generalized additive mixed effect models. The full model looked like this, which I will run you through. Important thing here is the everything that's contained within the S brackets, which is the smooth function, which makes the generalized additive mixed effect model additive, and basically means that the curve can be represented by several basis functions, as they are called, to, instead of just a linear effect, show a more complex wiggly effect. So, see in the model, we see the response variable, which was home range or depth for individual I at time j. We have an intercept, we have a smooth function for the noise, smooth function for temperature, linear function for the length for every individual. And this is a random effect per individual, since we expect there is a lot of individual variability between each call. Furthermore, temporal autocorrelation was accounted for using an autoregression function, a first-order autoregression function. Then the vocalizations were analyzed separately, and they were analyzed by first grouping the recordings into different groups based on the amount of noise that was present, and then comparing the vocalization statistics between the different groups. So first, for grouping, I used k-means clustering to minimize the within-group variance, and the results of this looked something like this. On the y-axis, we have the amount of observations, and time in hours on the x-axis. So we see that quiet recordings mostly occurred during the night, and during the day it got a bit more loud. This corresponds perfectly with what we expected. We expect more anthropogenic activity during the day, so we expect it to be louder during the day. These three groups were then further separated into night and day to account for possible DL patterns. So in the end, we had 6 groups. Due to time constraints, I was only able to analyze 10 grunts per group. And then the vocalization characteristics were analyzed for each of these grunts, and then the difference between their means was calculated using a Croscoe-Wallace test. This is to see if there is any difference between any groups. If there was, I used a pairwise Wilcoxon test to see between which groups this difference was. So first I will show you the results of the telemetry data. First, the home range. On the x-axis we can see the noise, and on the y-axis we can see the home range, and we see a correlation between an increasing amount of noise and a decreasing home range. In this final model, length of the individual, that is, was deemed to be insignificant. And furthermore, we see that the effect that occurs is more present during the night. Now, the rationale behind all of this is that when there is more noise, cod will reduce their exploratory activity, so they will move around less, leading to a smaller home range. And as we could see in the diagram before, there are less loud noises occurring during the night. So it might be that when they occur, cod is more startled and therefore reacts more heavily to the noise. Then for the depth, we see a similar pattern. As noise increases, the depth increases as well. Rationale behind this being when there's louder noise, cod want to move away from the source of the noise. What's very clear in this diagram, or in this graph though, is that there is a very large standard error. For both of these models, length was insignificant, and for the night, the temperature was insignificant as well. This was very unexpected because in previous research it was found that body size had a significant effect on the behavioral response to temperature in cod, and since temperature correlates with depth, we would expect to find something here. Of this result, I am thinking that most of this is due to the time that length was measured, because this was during the tagging process of cod. Cod were tagged in several stages, so there are several groups of tagged cod, and the variability in time was 3 years to 6 months prior to the start of this study. So length was probably not a very representative measure for the actual length of the cod during the time of the study. To move on to the vocalizations, we did find a significant increase in vocalization length and amount of pulses. We see the length in the first, pulse in the second. And with the Wilcoxon test, we determined that this was a difference between loud and mid noises versus quiet noises. And this corresponds with other findings that fish actually adapt their vocalizations to increasing background noise. This effect was only found significant during the day. Then, as for fundamental frequency and fatigue, while the Croscoe-Wallace test did show a significant difference in fundamental frequency at night between these groups, there were no significant differences found with the Wilcoxon test. This is likely due to the way the Wilcoxon test works, which is with an additional correction for multiple testing, which decreases the significance of the results that we found. I wanted to show the fatigue as well, since I was very excited when I first saw this box plot, and I was like, oh, this is a beautiful result, but unfortunately no significant result was obtained using the Croscoe-Wallace test. This is, I expect, because the amount of samples that I took was fairly small, 10 grams per group, so this would have probably had a large effect on the significance of the results. To conclude, we did find that noise had a significant effect on the home range depth and vocalizations of cod. This study was an observational study, and more research. It's a very young study, as in there aren't a lot of same studies, so more research is needed to quantify these effects. Nevertheless, the results do correspond with similar research, such as this one, where Arctic cod perceive vessel noise and presence as a threat and react by moving away and decreasing exploratory activities. As I said, regarding vocalizations, only a few of the analyzed vocal characteristics were significant, but this still suggests that there is some effect of noise and vocalizations. Other studies found correlations between communication, and spawning success. So this would be a next logical step to explore with this study. With that note, I want to end my presentation. Thank you all for listening, and please ask me anything about my work.